Politics is downstream from philosophy. People have suggested that politics is downstream from culture, but that's really an ideological proposition, a suggestion about the causal flow between these two aspects of the human condition. And there isn't a necessary relation in one direction or the other. Politics can shape culture, cultural dynamics can shape political life. It goes both ways. It's as true to say that culture is downstream from politics as it is to say vice versa. On the other hand, saying that politics is downstream from philosophy is just kind of logically true. In one sense, politics is a branch of philosophy, but it is also the output of philosophy. Politics as a branch of philosophy is inherently posterior to ethics as a branch of philosophy. It has to be, because putting forward a political prescription, whether formally and propositionally or, concretely and in a participatory way in a political program, suggesting that program means you are saying it is better than the alternative. It involves an ethical judgment. Political judgments entail ethical judgments, and there is no way of getting around that. Even if you're a moral nihilist and you engage politically in what you perceive to be, well, you can't even coherently talk about interest if you're a true moral nihilist, because it's just whatever you feel like, right? It's not true that one course is better or worse than another. It's all just according to your relativistic assignment of value. That's the only reality that value has. It's in the eye of the beholder. Even if that's your perspective, still, when you engage politically, what that means is informed and contextualized by your ethical theory. Hopefully that makes sense to people. Logically, politics is posterior to ethics. The concepts that politics uses also are posterior to ontology. If in your political theory you claim that people ought to have rights, or in your ethical theory that people ought to be treated as ends in themselves, well, unless you have an ontological account of what constitutes a person, those statements are kind of vacuous. It's like saying X ought to have rights. Okay, if you don't know what X is, then it's meaningless. So we have to have an account of the things that ethics and politics concerns, and ultimately, in order to make sense of our ontology, the set of beings that we propose in our worldview, we have to have a concept of the ground of those beings, not their individual existence or character, but that which supports their existence, their ground of being, their essence. And that's metaphysics. You'll also probably want to have an account of epistemology and logic so that you can justify your political prescriptions. But ultimately, politics is the intended output of philosophy, in my opinion. Once we've had the philosophical discourse, because I do think philosophy is inherently a social phenomenon. You can engage by yourself, but you'll be engaging with concepts that are culturally available to you in your cultural toolkit. That's a social thing. Philosophy is inherently social. So once we've had that philosophical discourse, at the end of it, we've resolved metaphysics, ontology, ethics. Now, what do we do? What does philosophy suggest that we do? And that's the place of politics. So that suggests a kind of platonic form of political cooperation. Ideally, in its purest form, politics should be established by reaching philosophical consensus, and especially ethical consensus, about the nature of our common good. And the way of going about that is necessarily universal. There is one correct way to arrive at political community. And I would say that transcends cultural borders, political national borders. Even if there were multiple species of life in the universe, there would be one ideal way to establish the ideal political order universally. And that would be to facilitate open philosophical discourse where all parties involved could reach consensus on the nature of the common good. Anything else is going to involve kind of unquestioned presuppositions, because if you question your presuppositions, then you're in a philosophical discourse and you can't arrive at consensus. If you don't want to do that, if you want to stake your claim on some particular cultural notion of what is right politically, like you believe in human rights, that's unquestionable. We're not going to, undermine that assumption in our theory. Well, then you can't reach political consensus with people who disagree, right? Or if you think that the interest of the state of Israel is primary and we cannot question the significance of the existence of that political entity, well, you can't reach political consensus with people who may believe philosophically that such national borders are actually not in the interest of the common good. I'm not making judgments there about who is right in all of that. But what I'm getting at is you can't arrive at this ideal political consensus, the ideal political order at any scale, unless you are willing to engage in self-reflective doubt and criticism of your own ideas. Kind of should go without saying. But in practice, when people engage politically, they assume that their values are right and they engage rhetorically with others. So rather than trying to hear someone else out and let them go on at length and try to understand where they're coming from, instead, people will engage in constant interruption. They'll engage in overloading, where they try to just monopolize all of the time in the conversation, putting out a lot of content so that the other person can't deal with it, overload them. Very common debate tactic. There's loading and framing, right? Where people will rely on kind of pop culturally salient values like, oh, this idea is cringe, or this idea is based. Or, when a certain concept or notion is regarded in a community as good or bad, people will kind of just bank on and ride on the cachet or ill repute of some given philosophy in politics. They'll do those things. They will play on people's instincts, not their philosophical ideas. They'll communicate a sense of urgency. They'll throw out a bunch of historical examples, current cultural events. They'll rely on popular understandings. This is what people typically do. And when they do that, they are not engaging philosophically. In an open discourse where anything can be said, you can't have true philosophy, because there's nothing that compels, that forces the person you're talking with to actually engage on the deeper level. Like when people throw out these whataboutisms, like, oh, what about this historical event or whatever, or this country. People argue about communism, they'll throw out, case studies. When people do that, they are implying ethical judgments that it implies a theory of ethics, but they won't actually spell out their theory of ethics. They'll take that as if it were granted. And that works, right? Because most people do share a lot of ethical intuitions. And people don't reason philosophically in general. You know, if you display dominance over your adversary in a debate, then people will be inclined to simply assume that your ethical frame is right, even if philosophically it's not justified or grounded. Just because you appear to be winning rhetorically, people will assume that philosophically your view is true. That's human nature. That's the way things are. So a completely open discourse doesn't amount to that true philosophical consensus building. If reason is universally real, right? There are universal laws of reason that we're all subject to. Then we should be able to arrive at philosophical consensus. If there's one truest philosophical worldview we could arrive at. And if you say that there's not, well, it seems then that you're putting forward some form of ethical, or rather philosophical relativism, where like each man is the measure of all things for him. It's kind of Protagorean stance. And that is self-contradictory for obvious reasons. If you say that what is true for each person is individually true for them, and there's no one universal truth, that itself is a universal truth claim, so it's incoherent. It defeats itself. If you suggest there isn't one universal truth about the nature of reality, that is putting forward a universal truth about the nature of reality. So that doesn't work. The only coherent suggestion philosophically is that there is a single truth about the nature of reality. And if reason and evidence and all of that, and I mean, it's hard to say what is primary, right? Because we use a bunch of different epistemological tools. We use empirical methods, statistical inference. There's theories about how to make informed philosophical decisions, but all of it relies kind of at the deepest level on judgments that are made, and there are logical relationships inherently built into the nature of human judgment. Judgments are like acts of predication. A judgment is saying that A is B or A is not B, and those have, metalogical rules which govern them. And unless you begin by assuming those metalogical rules have validity, that there is a correspondence between the operations of logic in human language and the structure of reality, then you can't really get philosophy off the ground, it seems to me. Of course, that could be philosophically debated. But in any case, if there is something that we can use to bootstrap a broader epistemology and a broader philosophical worldview, then that starting point is something that we should be appealing to reach the deepest possible consensus, rather than making a claim that some judgment is true a priori. Instead, we should begin with doubt. We should begin not by assuming a bunch of things to be true because our culture tells us that they're true, or because any given standard tells us they're true. Because cultures have been wrong, religions have been wrong. Philosophy involves a faith that reality is intelligible and there are ways of, reaching the truth. That's a kind of minimal condition for engaging in philosophical discourse. It's possible to reach the truth together if we engage in good faith. So basically, you can't have a completely open discourse where people arrive at a consensus about the common good, because people will use sophistical and rhetorical tactics, and you've all seen that in these spheres especially. Generally, if anyone identifies as a particular political label, they're kind of presupposing a bunch of things whenever they engage with others instead of engaging philosophically. So in any case, there is, though, another way of engaging, which is setting a space aside for philosophical discourse. And that space is an abstract space, not a literal space necessarily. You have to have literal channels of communication to facilitate the existence of this abstract philosophical agora that I'm suggesting. But I mean, what it amounts to is a willingness on the part of individuals, faith and willingness on the part of individuals to resolve our differences through rational discourse, philosophical discourse. If you're willing to engage in that, then you can be part of what I would term the true philosophical community. The true political community. And I think that is the ideal, and we can do that at a planetary scale. We have the technology to do it. What you can't do, though, hopefully I've identified the nature of this group adequately. There is the ideal political community that we can arrive at by establishing this ideal abstract philosophical space of discourse. What you can't do, and be a member of that space, is say to anyone that I won't engage with. The only reason you could give for not engaging with someone is if they won't engage philosophically. But provided that they are willing to go into all their presuppositions, provided they are willing to argue about the deepest underlying frameworks, then you have to engage with them in order to be part of this ideal group, the ideal polity. That is who I think should govern the planet. The people who demonstrate themselves to be participants in this ideal political/philosophical discourse. Anything else is going to involve an imposition of force arbitrarily on the basis that they think they're right, like the Rothschilds controlling the world through usury or whatever, whoever controls things at a global scale, they can leverage their power and influence and impose a world order given their presuppositions of what is valuable. Or you can have a group that cooperates directly to establish a network, a political network on a planetary scale that has that criteria at its heart. You can be part of this if you engage in an open philosophical way. And the output should be, okay, we agree then on what we ought to do. Let me take this from the smallest scale. What this looks like is, if you want to be part of this true philosophical/political community, you engage with me on political discourse, judgments of value and such. And once we agree, once we've had the discourse, and it may take hours, months, years to have this discourse, but once you have it thoroughly and all doubts are addressed, at least for the time being, then that should tell us what we ought to do together. And if we arrive at this idea of what we ought to do together, well then the true political community will do it. So you talk with me, resolve all of our differences philosophically, reach philosophical consensus, and then the output of that is what we ought to do politically together. And so we cooperate. Now we're part of the same community. Now we act together. Now I can anticipate an objection that many people in my audience will have. Well, doesn't this just presuppose a kind of multiculturalism, or anyone from any background can be part of the same community? And they would object to that on evolutionary biological reasons or for any number of conservative reasons. And that's an understandable objection. But what I'm talking about does not entail that. If we go through this philosophical method and you're right, the person who's offering this hypothetical objection, you're right that group evolutionary fitness is very important to ethics. Well then, people from different philosophical backgrounds, people from different ethnic backgrounds can nevertheless recognize that mutual fact and arrange their cooperation to allow differences to exist, to allow individual ethnic identities to persist, to facilitate that. But yeah, this is not a very common thought, right? The ideal political discourse, the ideal way of reaching political cooperation. Politics at a certain level is about facilitating cooperation. How do we do that? Either we leverage power and influence and violence, or we reach consensus about what we ought to do, and we act together to carry it out. There is necessarily one ideal way of doing that, and it is philosophical discourse in a true philosophical spirit. Not all discourse is automatically philosophical, even if it purports to be, because people can engage in rhetorical tactics. They can, do all of this stuff that I've talked about. True philosophical discourse is detached. It takes its time. There is no urgency. Things aren't decided once and for all by some big debate and clash. Instead, it's an ongoing process. It's an open environment where anyone can enter. It is that ideal agora. Anyone can enter at any time and offer what they think, as long as they're willing to listen and engage with the other people involved. Philosophical consensus is possible. Now, there's a kind of meta level here of how you structure that discourse, but that can be determined through an open philosophical method, right? You and I, in principle, agree that what I'm saying is right, that if we reach philosophical consensus, we can reach political consensus, and we can cooperate in the interest of the good, of the planet, of the universe, ultimately. If we do that, then, you can suggest how we ought to go about the discourse. I can offer what I have to say, and we build from there. And we can build norms and build technologies to facilitate that discourse and this process of consensus building. But it starts with, you have to be willing to talk. So if you want to be part of this true political community that should govern things at the planetary scale, that's what I believe, then you have to be willing to talk to anyone who is open for this. I'm open for this, and so that's where I start. I am willing to reach consensus with others through as many conversations as it takes. I'm willing to talk with anyone at the philosophical level. If you're coming to the table with a bunch of presuppositions that you cannot question, that you assume you're right on, it's not philosophy. And you can't engage with that philosophically. And so that's not what I'm talking about. But if you can engage philosophically, if you are willing to question those things, well, then what we ought to do, for the time being at least, is have the discourse, have it out. So that is an open invitation. You've seen, I've talked to a lot of people on this channel, and I've let them express themselves. I do allow people, I don't try to control what people are able to say. I try to be a place where people can have open philosophical discourse. So that is an invitation that has been long-standing with my channel, will continue to be the case with my channel. If you want to build consensus philosophically, if you think that's right, then talk with me, because I am one of those people who's willing to do it. If you're also one of those people, we should talk. And if you think you shouldn't talk to me, or if you think that you shouldn't have philosophical discourse, I think you're going to find very kind of troubling consequences that ultimately result from that. So if you think I'm right, good, talk to me. If you think I'm wrong, really think about where I'm going wrong. Where am I going wrong in my reasoning? And, what should I do instead? You'll find that if you want to claim that I'm wrong and persuade me that I'm wrong, in a way, you're already kind of conceding that I'm right, because we're resolving this, again, in a philosophical space, determining who's right and wrong, what is true and untrue in all of this, and then determining political action. So it's almost like, even if you say that I'm wrong and you want to convince me that I'm wrong, you're kind of assuming I'm right. Maybe that's illusory, maybe there's something else going on there. But in any case, that's the concept that I wanted to discuss today. Thank you guys for listening. God bless.